Is the internet being rewritten, this time around property, digital identity, and economic agency? And if digital assets become programmable and money begins to carry logic, questions once considered theoretical may define the next phase of global internet infrastructure. From Hong Kong's push into stablecoins to Japan's cultural IP renaissance, is Asia rapidly becoming the architect of an entirely new digital economy? This episode of the Asia Tech Podcast wants to know, what happens if digital property rights become a foundation layer for the internet? How do identity, interoperability, and programmable money converge into a new economic operating system? And is Asia moving faster than the rest of the world to build it? To unpack these questions and more, we are joined by Waitze, co-founder and executive chairman of Animoca Brands, and Kenneth, Shek, project lead at Mocha Network. How are you guys doing today? Welcome to the show.
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Doing well. Thanks for having us.
Awesome. I was looking into this, right? And tell me if I'm wrong here, but you've always had this idea of digital property rights for all. It shaped a lot of today's Web3 thinking. Where are the philosophical gaps in the early internet that made digital property rights not just desirable, but inevitable?
Well, I think if you go back to the early days of the internet, right? The revolution of the internet was not just the distribution of information, but the equal access of that. It was also the fact that we had same information that we could make commercial decisions on, right? The earliest use cases of that was some farmer in China that was selling rice suddenly knew that his rice, because of the internet, was sold for literally 900% more. And he's like, wait, hold on, that's not fair. Yeah, that's not fair. But they didn't know that, right? And so all the trade spots in the world were basically just arbitraging information because information was power, right? And so really, the early days of the internet completely democratized and sort of made that available. And not only did we have e-commerce sites like Alibaba and eBay and eventually Amazon and those guys all emerged and sort of changed that. It also created a different form of information arbitrage, and that came in the form of code, data, and open source. And that actually really grew the space as a whole. And suddenly it wasn't about, if you might remember back in the days, it was like closed source. Nobody would trust Linux or some stranger somewhere on the internet writing some code that you would compose and build on top of. And now it's become the standard, right? However, the challenge, and then I'll come, and then maybe Kenneth has something to say to this one as well, but the standard then basically became open source as a more, as I like to call it, a barter style trade of value. Kind of like information was the barter, as opposed to back in the early days, we didn't have money. So I would give you an apple and you might give me a pear, or I give you some cows and you might give me something else, right?
I might give you my daughter, actually, if you gave me a cow, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Some stories around that as well, right? For sure. But there was basically a trade of that type of value that took place. And that's basically what open source was in a way, in the sense that I give you my code, and you can take my code and you do stuff with it. And if you make it better, you give it back to me and the community as a whole, right? It was very communal, very sort of community oriented, right? And the next phase of that, though, is one actually, how do you sort of distribute the rights around this? And that's basically where property rights came in from. And property rights in the classical sense is why we have wealth creation and capitalism. Without property rights, you don't have capitalism. And that means you have IP protection and you have all these things, the ownership of your house and home and all these things that we consider sacrosanct in most places around the world. But we didn't have that in the internet. And then all the property basically became sort of controlled by the central platforms, causing many of the problems we have today, right?
Yeah, tons of them. Can I just follow up on something with you? Because you said that open source is like a new kind of arbitrage. I'm very familiar with arbitrage. I traded on a trading desk. We had information arbitrage all over the world. It was good for us. We made money because we knew that we had this information, other people had that information, and it skewed the prices in different markets. But how is open source an arbitrage?
Well, open source was an arbitrage for those who understood how to code. So I got access to open information, and I had the ability to take advantage of it that others couldn't. And by the way, we have similar constructs today in other ways. For instance, finance. Like much of the financial information in the markets is public information, but only the person who understands finance can take advantage of it. And so they make more money, right? So so that's what I mean by arbitrage. But there's a lot more to that as well. Yeah.
You can go as deep as you want to stuff. Kenneth, did you want to add to anything?
Yeah.
Or
please.
No, I think another arbitrage is for example, open source libraries. So there's a lot of people contributing to it, but then there's also people who have commercial sense and able to monetize based on those open source software. And those who are able to put the price tag and they know how to do pricing structure, product marketing, that's another form of arbitrage that basically is you can actually leverage that to monetize from it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Linux was actually born. I remember when Linux was actually being developed. And believe me, I think I was probably at Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs back then when Linux came out. And they essentially took all of their servers, at least the back-end servers, and switched them from Unix, right, which they were paying Sun for, and did Linux. But you're right, the arbitrage was there. And that's the whole creation of Red Hat, who said, we know how to use this better than anybody else. And even though Linux itself, you don't have to pay for it, we'll manage it for you. And then Red Hat's a multi-billion-dollar company. Sorry, please go ahead.
Yes, no, that's right. But I think also that was the early internet sort of iterations of the internet where people were trying to figure out how to monetize open source because they didn't quite know how to do that. I mean, you mentioned Red Hat. The other one was VA Linux, right? Like those were all those companies that emerged to basically try and create a business model out of open source. And it didn't quite work for them at the end of the day, right? Because it was open source, right? So really, when you think about how the value was created, much of the value was created from people taking open source and creating products of their own, rather than servicing others, right? Whereas Red Hat really was, something like a moment in time, but it wasn't going to be lasting as a business because eventually everyone knew how to do open source. That was the whole point. If you made open source as distributed as it were, then actually there was no need to have a middleman essentially do the work, as it were, right? And then actually things like sort of GitLab and GitHub actually became much more fundamental than, say, VA Linux or Red Hat. But of course, back in the sort of late 90s, people didn't know that. They were experimenting. And in many ways, what's happening in crypto is the same, right? We're experimenting. Every year, we're innovating and iterating on the business model. We can't fully know what it is yet. We just have to keep trying. Right? It's kind of like early days. I mean, if you remember pets.com.
Yeah, I do. I do.
I mean, so the idea wasn't that crazy.
No.
Hey, we'd be buying our pet supplies online. It was just happened to be about 15 years too early. But yes, right? Or, like ICQ or Vocal Tech, basically, just VoIP, right? It was just a bit too early, right?
But I mean,
so all these
even food delivery in New York, I forget the name of the company, but like this thing was a spectacular disaster. And now there's DoorDash, do you know what I mean? Which is a multi-billion-dollar global company and tons of other delivery companies like that. But you bring up a really good point, actually. So where do you think we are in the stage of Web3 in relation to, you can relate it to open source, you can relate it to like the internet as well, right? Because I do remember pets.com had nothing to do with open source. It just had to do with maybe the infrastructure and the throughput and the connectivity wasn't there enough. And of course there were no smartphones, so that was another thing too. But where are we in the context of Web3? And maybe you can define for people that don't understand what Web3 is per se. Like I get it, you get it, but maybe some of the listeners don't. Do that first and then maybe you can dig into that.
Yeah, so I mean, first, and maybe I'll start this. I'll take this question first because I think I'm a little older than Kenneth, so he might have still been in his diapers.
He doesn't know pets.com at all. He's wondering like, what are these two guys talking about?
Yeah, when we talk about sort of the early 2000s or something, So yeah, but anyway, so very quickly, I mean, the way that we like to define Web3, and people have slightly different definitions, but the way we define it is as basically the web of ownership, right? Meaning that it's for the first time you can actually have digital property rights that are truly yours, which is what you can't do in either Web 1 or Web 2. So, the classical definition has been Web 1 is read, right? The websites that you read online. Web 2 is read-write, where you had the ability to write to the web that became the social web, blogs, Facebook, Instagram, we contributed to the web. And then Web 3 is read, write, and own. So the final layer, meaning that now you can own essentially the network, the data, and the value that's constructed from it. But I think just to sort of dig a little bit deeper on this point,
please,
when we say ownership, what is it that you really own?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
And and the parallel of ownership actually, and the representation of that, like a contract, like a piece of paper, is actually the token. So the token represents ownership in the network. So if I own Bitcoin or Ethereum, I become an owner in the network, right? Which is really, if you think about it, a novel concept, but actually isn't that novel when you think about the fact that when I own a house, for instance, do you own a house because you physically live in the house?
No, you have a deed.
No, you have a deed. And who guarantees the deed?
The government.
The deed is guaranteed by the government. And if the government is not stable, you do not own that house.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And so you need a sort of rules-based legal system or law structure, as it were. And that's what blockchain enables. And that's why blockchain is critical, because blockchain is that decentralized infrastructure that is essentially the rules-based law of the internet, as it were.
So why do you need a blockchain to have digital ownership? And I guess this is a fundamental question. And I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, about digital identity and digital ownership. If the government is there, and you said this, right, and the government is stable, well, then the deed is just real. It just is like, this is my house. You can't come in and take my house. But in plenty of countries where the government is unstable, it doesn't matter if you have a deed or not. There's no property rights. There's nothing, because anybody can just come in and abscond with it. But why do we need blockchain to make digital property ownership, whether it's a token or anything else, ownership?
Well, maybe the very quick thing to think about it is that blockchain is the safe and secure way in which you have a permanent record of an asset or an item that can then be provable yours. And that's basically the deed of record. So from an enforcement, that doesn't solve enforcement, but it does solve proof of ownership. So for instance, if someone stole your Bitcoin, you can still go to the government and say, I can prove that my Bitcoin was stolen, and therefore the government can do something about it, right? No different than if someone stole your car or stole something else, you at least have the proof that it was your car, and then someone can come and try to rectify that if that's possible. But you can't extinguish the record of that ownership. It is permanently there. That proof of record is essentially your patent or your copyright or your claim towards that asset. And the problem is that in the internet today, much of our data and our time isn't owned by us, it's owned by a platform. And the platform decides the rules of that. Right? And I think Kenneth can go into all sorts of areas in which basically the internet is not owned by us, but it's owned by the platform, and everything where we just don't have property rights.
So how do we take what the existing structure is? Right, because if I zoom out to like 35,000 feet and I look at who owns all of my data and who owns all of my time and who owns all of my information, I'm just trying to think, how do we get it away from them? And you can pick any big platform as a proxy, right? Let's say Facebook, because it's a pretty good, beating horse, right? But they own a ton of data. Not on me, because I don't give it to them, but for a ton of people they do, right? And Instagram is the same way. Like, all these big companies own all this data. How do you get it away from them, but still live in a world that's stable? Does that make sense? Where you can still go to the government and say, this is actually mine, and I have a digital record of it being mine. Does that make sense, right? Because Apple has a ton of my data too. I'm not super happy with all of that, but in some cases I'm like, I don't really care. So maybe you can comment on that as well.
Yeah. Oh, I can now. I think that's a great question. So all these walled gardens are actually creating all these fences around the user, so that you basically trap all the data by all these like FANG companies, and for good reasons, because they need to monetize the data. Basically, they provide free services. That's the way how they monetize it and actually sustain the company. But then, what if you as a user, you want to monetize your data, or you want to prove to another company that you actually own those data? What you can actually do. There's actually a court case around when the user actually trying to download their Gmail data and trying to monetize them, and Google is trying to sue the user because it's like there's a rule and law that you cannot actually monetize the data if you call the Gmail API. There's an actual law on that, not a law, but like a fine print on it.
Well, terms of service,
yeah, terms of service, and to be honest, like me looking at my email. And that's my data. It's my friends sending me email, my colleagues sending me email. If I want to monetize, why I cannot monetize it? Because technically it's my data. So there are many ways to do that, and especially recently. And Mocha Network actually have like a technology that allow the user to basically log into the site, able to capture the data on the user own, and able to prove that the data is coming from the official API, and prove to any other apps that I actually own the data and able to verify anywhere. And that's a very powerful thing, is because the first time the user can actually prove anywhere else that they own those data, and they can verify them, and they can monetize on their own.
So run me through this in a really simple example, right? I like to do like a one company, one simple example. And you can use Gmail as an example of this. How do then I disintermediate the fact that Google owns all of my email through Mocha, if that's what you're suggesting? Do I have to, like, what's the process? Do I sign up for Mocha? Does it just do it for, like, how does all that work, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, so it's as simple as like signing up for Mocha, and there's probably going a little bit more technical here, but like in order to receive information and data through email or the website, to return information and data on the screen on the front end, there's a handshake process between the browser and the backend API. The backend API is returning the data. What Mocha service is actually doing is representing the user to call the backend API. And when the API is returning the data to the user on the screen, actually Mocha services is actually allowing the user to own that data and prove that it's directly returned by that API. So in some sense, it's doing two things. One is to help the user to capture the data. Second is to prove that the data is being returned by the official API from that website.
Right. So it's actually the data that I expect that data to be, right? So it does
maybe
some kind of data confirmation. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can put sort of a parallel to this back in the early days of the internet versus where we are today. You know, if you remember back in the early days, actually, certainly I did, we all ran our own web servers.
Yeah.
We all ran our own email servers, right?
Yeah.
We had our own SMTP servers. I used to run Apache, you know, basically.
I can't believe I did that, but I did.
Yeah, right. We all ran our servers. We plugged it onto the internet on some kind of crappy line. And this was even before we had, you know, basically what used to be called basically sort of, I guess, these web hosting services that eventually became AWS. But those are companies like Rackspace and ISPs and so on. You know, you would host a server with them, but they were still your server and so on, right? So it's some technical implementation needed. Now, what actually happens technologically is the handshake and the communication is actually effectively a direct confirmation between your service and that other service. But of course, the number of people who understood how to do this was only a handful of people, right? So in other words, when I delivered an email to your server, actually that transaction was really between two counterparties. There was no middleman, right? And so what I see Mocha and really blockchain technology enabling is bringing it back to that point where effectively the transaction layer is now going directly again away from the intermediary, who are effectively creating a tax and, in my perspective, a theft of our data in the intermediate to do so. Now, that's because they promise you something, which is convenience. Right? They say, I make it easy for you so that you don't have to worry about it. But the cost of that easiness, that simplicity, is 99% of the value. And you do that long enough, you don't know what the value is anymore, right? Now imagine, just quickly, just imagine if we all had sort of our own servers and they were truly decentralized as the original internet was envisioned. And I wanted to trade and transact with you. I could set my own rules around that transaction. You want to send me an email? Maybe you got to pay me $1, right? Right? Because, you know, I have a certain value. Or I accept every email because I want to talk to everyone. Doesn't matter. But you set the rules of the gateway because it's your server. You control that, right? And so what Mocha Network does with a digital ID, but what blockchain does with gas fees and so on, it effectively creates a gating mechanism because it's yours. You decide the rules. You decide what it gets paid for. And you decide the value construct around this, right? Now, that sounds abstract for most people because they look at this and say, well, you know, I don't do this. The thing is, nothing is free, right? We know this, right? At least theoretically and philosophically. However, we've somehow become accustomed that the internet ought to be free and our networks ought to be free and our data somehow seems free. But of course, it's a big lie because the reality is that they make the value. And just to underscore that value, online advertising is where most of that value goes to the Googles and Apples and platform for providing free services, which is $800 billion a year, moving to $1 trillion.
But this is my big question though, right? Is that, and it seems like a throwaway word, but you said 90% of the value is tied up in this idea of convenience, right? And I think it's partly generational, right? Like my dad could probably have run his own email server, but he couldn't be hassled to do it. Like he was technical enough that he knew how to do it. I did it because I thought it was fun. Right? Because I had free time and I had a powerful computer at home and I'm like, I wonder how Apache works. I wonder how I can set up my SMTP server. Like it was fun for me. But there are plenty of people that don't have the same fun experience that I have or that you had or that Kenneth has, but still needs the convenience. And I'm just using email as a proxy for all the other services that we get. How do you convince enough people, right, that owning their own data is a better way to live than having just convenience?
I think it's a very simple answer. And I think blockchain and tokenization is proof of that. When you have thousands of dollars on the line, you start going, oh, there's something there. The problem is they don't know what that's worth, right? I mean, this is true for anything. The moment they understand, I mean, like let's take like an example that's just a little bit more trite, but you know, Pokemon cards. right?
Pokemon
Cards.
Yeah, Pokemon cards.
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
enough.
Pokemon cards were not very valuable for the longest of time, but I can tell you, if even even adults are like,
Pokemon.
talking to their kids and saying, "You have Pokemon cards? Do you know what they're worth?" like my wife is like saying, "You know what? We should maybe, not that she ever thought they were valuable, but because our kids used to collect Pokemon cards, she doesn't want to throw them away right now,
I got it.
right?" But it's only because there was a value established, right? And so the point is that if you know what that value is, then you will not give it up. The problem is that we don't know what that value is. And by the way, this is true, for instance, in the case of what we see in many parts of the world, the people who are not living in a capitalist setup or don't want to and reject it, right? And saying, hey, I need to take money from everyone, billionaires are bad and all that kind of stuff, right? But the reason is because they're not part of the system. And there's, a lot of things that need to be fixed. Don't get me wrong about that. But the point is that from their vantage point, right, they don't understand sort of how money is made. They don't understand capitalism. They don't understand property rights. So the answer is, well, nobody should have property, so we can all be the same. Not understanding the consequences, it's ignorance. And I think the same is true here.
Right. So, but that's upside down, right? I don't think, and I think you would agree with me. I don't think the right thing to do is, if some people don't have property rights, then nobody should have property rights. Like, that's silliness. I
agree
with that. Yeah.
I agree. I totally agree. But that is a philosophical sort of construct and a political one that is much of a debate in the world. I mean, look at what's happening in America. Look what's happening in Europe. Thankfully, not so much in Asia because of historical reasons, but very much so in America. There's a divide right now. And what I'm saying is that people online don't understand that they're giving away literally billions of dollars of value collectively to the platforms, just like that. They just don't know it.
Right,
so that's part of.
But this is the big question for me, right? Is that let's say I'm rounding, right? Let's say there are 8 billion people in the world, 4 billion of them are connected to the internet, and 3,900,000,000 of them don't have any idea of how to calculate the value of the data that they're putting out there. How do you? Because this is the key, right? If they're ignorant, which does not mean stupid, it just means uninformed. But if there's ignorance around the value of that stuff, I guess there are a bunch of different questions around this. Is how do you establish what that value is, right? And again, this gets back to the arbitrage question that we were talking about before, because it could have different value for different people. And the second thing is, just at a more basic level, how do you remove the ignorance over time so that people actually understand? If you open a pizza shop, people are waiting out in line. They've got $10 in their pocket to pay for. You know what the value is. It's pretty easy to figure out. And if you see the line, you can tell that there's value there. But in the digital world, it's harder for people to figure out. Sorry, go ahead. How do you get rid of that ignorance?
I think everything just connects with each other, what we just talked about in terms of information arbitrage. One very fun fact and fun story. I just met with a partner today, is a great friend, is a Waitze founder, and he has a company that actually helps users to listen to their email. So when you receive email receipts from Uber, Foodpanda, Deliveroo, you actually capture all of the order value and all the data from the user. What they do is they monetize their data with private equity firms, with market research firms that are making tons of money. They got reached out by, I cannot say which name, but like there's a pretty large big tech company. They set up an AI entity, and they call him and be like, hey, can I pay you for 500 Singaporean bank statements? And I'm willing to pay $20 per bank statement. Yes, because I need to train and fine tune my AI model. All of the mass public web scrape data is not valuable anymore because basically becoming a commodity. What is going to be truly valuable is the personal data that is tied to a specific person. And basically, there is a price. It's just the price is the information arbitrage that is not public. And over time, that information would become more public, more fluid, and people would be aware of it and be like, oh, my bank statement is worth $20. I would do it. And probably my bank account is less than $20, and probably that would, right? So at the end of the day, it's all about information arbitrage, and it's just like being known by a very small group of people right now. But imagine people in Africa or like South America and so on realize if they send a bank statement, they can make $20. Would they do it?
So they do it if they got at least 10 out of the $20 or maybe 15 out of the $20, right? So that's the whole point here. And how do you create a construct where that value can be shared? And that's exactly what blockchain and basically tokenization can do. Because when you think about the addition, when you add content or when you add value into any kind of a network, how do I share that network across a large swath of people? And the traditional way we think of this is equity. Oh, you could become a shareholder in a company, but how do you have 1 million shareholders? That's kind of hard. What about 10 million shareholders? How about 1 billion? It just doesn't work, right? However, when you do it as a token, you can imagine that you could have a network that could have 1 million, 100 million, 1 billion owners, all sharing in the construct of a decentralized network, which we've seen with blockchain, with crypto, basically, as a construct, right? And as a result, you can now have an organization that can share value across literally the entire planet in a decentralized but also much more equitable way. Right? And that's really why we think, basically, just to your very earlier part of the question, why Web3 and crypto is ultimately going to win, because it's all about value to the end user. They have to understand it. You remember the days when, in the early years of the internet, it's like, how does a website compete with a magazine or a newspaper? It just doesn't. Okay, you look at this and you say, my goodness, like, who's going to read that stuff, right? And so many have dismissed it out of hand. I mean, one of the very first sort of, I forgot if this wasn't in Wired or some article, but it's like, the internet is dead after the .com bust, right? It was a fad. It's all gone, right? But somehow it continued because users recognized that there was value in being online. Even the interface was not as beautiful, or it wasn't a glossy magazine, because information was just more valuable, direct and quick, and you gained value from that. And that's exactly what we'll see here happen as well. So that's why we think Web3 will ultimately win.
So can we talk a little bit about digital identity and why that's so important and how it manifests itself, actually, and then what the push and pull is between, like, governments managing identities, right, through passports and just traditional ways that governments have always managed identity, right? Like, my producer's Brazilian. She's got a Brazilian passport. I'm American. I have an American passport. My daughter has a Japanese. But, like, the governments are really keen on managing identity. What does digital identity look like, and what's the interplay between governments and platforms and the tokenization and the blockchain, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people, when we talk about digital identity, a lot of people would assume that digital identity is only about identifying you as a person, your passport information, your date of birth, your passport number.
Yeah, it's just the easiest way to think about it. But go ahead. I didn't mean to say that, but go ahead.
But when I talked to 10 people, probably 9 out of 10 would assume that that's digital identity, which is fine, because that's just the assumption of it. But how we see digital identity is actually the data behind that person and the depth of the data. And how Yat would put it is basically the reputation that tied to the identity, and what actually represent you as a person that actually shape and value your reputation and put a valuation or price on top of the data that you own, actually come from a lot of different sources. It comes from your banks, it comes from your travel history, it comes from your family, and many other things. The thing is, what kind of access and what kind of privileges or rewards and all these identity data would enable you to get access to. And one very good example, which I know Yat has a lot of perspective on it, is in the crypto world, if you want to basically borrow money, you need to over collateralize, right? The LTV ratio of actually borrowing money in crypto, you actually need to collateralize a lot of tokens and a lot of money in order to borrow the same amount of money. But in the Web2 world, if you want to borrow money, you have unsecured loan, you can get a personal loan just by your salary history and all that. But in crypto and blockchain, just because you're not able to identify the data behind the user who is borrowing money, and naturally you need to over collateralize it. And that is creating a lot of capital inefficiency. What if you can actually prove digitally on who you are, your income, your reputation, your payback history, and so on?
So, and maybe just to augment one thing, going back a little bit in time, since we're having so much fun going back to the 80s and 90s, right? Let's just do this. You remember, I mean, our first point of reputation and identity online was often our email address, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
you would know a lot about somebody if they were on AOL or Yahoo or Google or whatever.
Or Hotmail,
or
all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, right?
Yep.
And it was, if you might remember, if you had your own domain name.
Oh my
that
God.
was special.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're like, oh, right?
I just got a chill thinking about it, actually. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, right? It's like that was special, right? And people paid for that, right? And so people paid for the inboxes to have a certain identity. And then you had the things like domain names, where you could have you at Tokyo.com or you at Hongkong.com or whatever. Right? Like there was the domain squatting effectively took place as well, right? And now you can't buy your .com that you want to because chances are someone else has it and is literally selling it like digital real estate, right? And I think when you think about domain names as a early sort of proxy for the value of your digital identity or your digital presence, as it were, as a kind of digital land, that actually was the first and most powerful example of that. Because whether I'm squatting on your domain name or whether I'm creating a new one, it brings attention because, of course, we as humans will go and search for stuff and automatically, regardless of AI and everything, will still gravitate towards sort of one identity or the other because we see it and it's where our attention is. And I kind of just to sort of bring back another point here, which is ultimately, it's all about sort of where we get our attention, right? We want to build our reputation because we seek some form of social validation, right? I mean, I think it's this sort of classic thing of what is the ultimate punishment for a human beyond, of course, passing away.
It's removing their identity.
Is basically going to jail, right? Which means you're cut off from society, which means you lose your reputation and you're nobody. And I mean, just think about that. You are now sort of locked up from making a social connection to the world and being somebody. And that is the ultimate punishment, right? So bad that you would be like, I won't do it. Like if you think about it, if we were loners and we weren't social creatures, we wouldn't really care. But actually, we do care that we're disconnected that way. So that is important. So everything is centered around that attention. It's why we care about, I think the platforms have figured that out and hacked it. That's why they care about giving us 1 million followers or 1,000 followers or like so many likes, because that attention gives us that dopamine kick, that gives us that validation. And I think is a very base human need that we have. And when it comes about property, just on my final point here, what is our ultimate property that we owned as a basis before everything? It was a property of our own name, right? I mean, most of us were serfs and slaves. We worked and were the property of a king or some royalty or some church of some sort, right? We were their property, which is why most of us have last names. I mean, I make this joke a little bit, but look at what's the most popular last name in China. It's like, I think it's Wang. And in Korea, it's Kim, right? It's like,
well, in the English-speaking world, it's Smith. But what does that mean? It means worker.
Yes, exactly, right? Or like in Germany, it's like butcher, or whatever. Like it was something you did. But the moment you got to own your own name, you could then build the foundation from that. It was literally your first property, right? And in a funny way, in an ironic way, in the digital world, we actually gave away all of our digital identity and all of our property in our own name to someone else. Those followers on Instagram, not your followers. That network you have on X, not your network, right? I mean, you're literally leasing it and are at their mercy. And if they decide they don't like you, then you're gone. And that's something that, too many people still don't fully recognize how precarious a situation they actually live in.
So this is a common theme though, right? A lot of people don't recognize it. And, Kenneth said earlier, 9 out of 10 people don't know this thing or that thing or the other thing. I'm just wondering, like, how far along the curve do we have to go? And like, what regulations need to change so that Web3 can win? I would make the case to you that I don't disagree that it's a better world where, like, I own my identity. And I made a note to myself, like, Kenneth made a really good point. I think he said 9 out of 10 people would just think your identity is just your passport number, your face, and like your last name. But the reality is your identity is very complex. It's multi-layered, and it's built on a whole bunch of things that are both some things you control and some things you don't control. It's even the thoughts that people have about you or the things that people have written about you also is part of your identity. And you want to own all that too. But like, what has to change? Because in the current structure that we exist in today, the non-Web3, not the read, write, and own, but just the kind of write. Like, I feel like we're not in Web3 yet at all, if that's the idea. But what do we have to do to get there? Like, you're convinced it's going to win. And look, you've built your entire career around it. That's the whole point of Animoca anyway, is trying to create an infrastructure to do that. But we're not there yet. What do we have to do to get there? And is it going to be in our lifetime, or is it going to be in our kids' lifetime? Like, what's going to have to change to make that happen? Because I'm submitting to you that I think that could be a better world, but I feel like it's going to be a slog to get there.
I mean, maybe I'll start off quickly. I think we're maybe in under 5 years, we're going to get to a point where we're going to have very, very fast acceleration there. Why do I say that? Well, one, it has to do with what's the value construct that I perceive in this world. And when you talk about maybe more our generation, okay, right? We have a different attitude towards scarcity, and we have a different mindset because of how we were brought up. And also we think of it as equity and commodities and gold, and that is obviously of value, right? However, if you look at our children, what do they think is valuable to them? What's valuable to them is how many followers they have on Instagram, or how many likes they have, what their digital reputation looks like, for instance, right? And also, what social cred they get virtually. And also, they tend to be the ones that are the fastest adopters of crypto. Ask your children what they want for Christmas. Very likely, it's going to be some virtual item from Roblox or from Fortnite or something, or some virtual currency. They don't want dollars, and they don't want something that they can buy chewing gum or something. They want something virtual, right? So they're already living in that world, right? And so to me, it's kind of like the internet as well. The internet was not designed for the equivalent of our generation 30 years ago, right? It was designed for the young people who basically then progressed into it over time.
I mean, we were our children 30 years ago.
Correct.
Right? Let's be fair.
Exactly.
I don't know how old
exactly.
you are, but I know that I know how old I am, and I'm just saying that, like, when the internet first started, I was my daughter's age.
Well, let me just say, my first commercial experience was when I was using CompuServe. So that gives you an idea.
Fair enough.
Okay. Gives you an idea of the generation in question here. Yes.
Go ahead.
So that I think is first of all, it's going to be youth led, as it typically is, right? But then the second part is, and I'm sure Kenneth has other thoughts around this, but the second part is, it's around value, right? And how you generate that, understanding what that value is, right? Like today, why do so many young people just think about, even like when you ask them, what do you want to be? And they say, I want to be a YouTuber. What? Like, it's like ask that question, like even 10 years ago, like what is that as a construct? Or social media influencer, or like, travel blogger. I mean, like, what are these jobs that you would have never even thought of, right? But when they look at that, that's the world that they understand, and they understand very well how to gain attention there, and how to do, get the followers, and how to do engagement in these mechanisms, which, we have much more difficulty in, which is just not our world, right? So they already understand that value. It's all virtual, it's all digital, right? And so as a result, now they can extend that value in financial means, which then gives them better living and better opportunities. And that's exactly what we think will drive that change. When people say, oh, I can make money this way. I mean, look at media. Media did not get disrupted because a bunch of kids just decided to put websites and, hey, it was fun. It's because those websites started making more money than the actual commercial enterprises, right? Suddenly, Mr. Beast popped up, and he's like making hundreds of millions of dollars, or some crazy figure, much more than, a super established, long-standing organization that was selling trad media, right? Or, basically MCNs or like basically sort of media networks online suddenly had more followers and more impact than, some studio around the world, right? So it's because of the commercial opportunities that are so much more easily realized.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, this is why I do what I do, right? Because I saw an opportunity that this type of online media was going to make way more money, have way more impact, and be way more interesting than going on television, whatever that even means anymore, right? Like
Correct.
I have
Correct.
a TV at home and I never watch it. I just use it as a computer.
Right.
As a
I mean,
computer
who watches
monitor.
television these days?
Nobody.
Right?
Nobody. But you're
yeah.
right. But the point is, like, I'm still concerned a little bit about, because I feel like I spent my whole life when I was at Morgan Stanley and at Goldman Sachs, like living inside this bubble, feeling that like everybody knew the stuff that I knew. Not just in the financial world, but in the broader world, right? Because part of working in finance means I've got to follow the news, not just the news in Japan, where I was living, but what's going on in Korea, what's going on in the US, what's going on in all these other countries, UK, Europe, right? South America, Central America. I had to know all of this stuff, but then I'd have conversations with other people who were well educated. I would say like doctors and lawyers and stuff like that, and they would be like, I have no idea what's going on in Korea. Zero. So I'm just wondering, like, what do we have to do to get people involved into this thing? Not that it's not better or worse.
Yeah, I mean, there is a base level of knowledge here that is required. I agree with that. But the base level of knowledge here has to do, like, there's industry-specific professions, which, in my opinion, AI is definitely going to sort of mass amateurize anyway in some form or fashion. Like for instance, we're going to talk about sort of better health and medicine and that kind of stuff. the internet and AI agents and so on are actually really very constructive already in terms of how to live better and longer and healthier in a way, right? So I see that element happening. But the other part is around what's the base level knowledge that we will have. And again, I love to go back in time since I think we share similar generations.
You're on fire today.
We used to have this thing called digital literacy.
Yeah, we did.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had to print my email for my boss. I mean,
yeah, no, believe me, I had a boss too. We had to print
Yes.
his emails out.
Yeah,
for sure.
right? Because he's like, I don't know what this is, right?
I don't know what to do with
it's
this
like
thing.
it's a fax machine, isn't it? Like, not really, but anyway, right? So we printed out those emails so he could read that because he wasn't digitally literate. Now, if you're not digitally literate, though, what does it mean for you to live in the world today? You become irrelevant, right? You're gone. You don't exist. If you're not on Google, you don't exist for a certain generation. If you're not on LinkedIn, or if you're not on Instagram, you're irrelevant. And now, if you're not AI discoverable, you're irrelevant. Right? Like, it doesn't matter what that cycle is. You eventually become irrelevant if you don't move with the times, right? And the base construct here is that we believe, anyway, that basically financial literacy will go the way of digital literacy. So in other words, because of tokenization, which means essentially financifying or assetizing anything and everything in the world, we're going to make the world more financially literate. And that means at a base level, we all have to have a certain level of financial literacy as we have digital literacy. Which today
that's interesting.
Is a small number.
That's interesting, actually. And I want to share something with you because I think it's kind of humorous, but also kind of indicative of this point that you're making. I live in Bangkok. I don't own a car. I don't want to own a car, to be fair. And I get around mostly either take the train or take a motorcycle taxi, which many people think is insane, but it's the easiest way to get around the city is by a motorcycle taxi. It's the greatest thing ever invented. But in Thailand, you have something called prompt pay, right? So, and what that means is that I can QR code pay for anything. And the motorcycle guys, again, this is because they want to make themselves relevant still, right? I don't have to pay them cash. They all have a QR code. And I didn't know that for the longest time. And I was riding on one of these motorcycles one day, not that long ago. And I said to the guy, QR, can I pay by QR code? And he pointed at the back of his helmet. And I just thought he didn't understand what I was saying, right? Because I don't speak Thai that well. And I didn't notice, but there was a QR code taped to the back of his helmet. But this is a really good point. And the only reason why I'm pointing this out is because that's financial literacy at scale. And if you have to build that into your life, and I see it everywhere in Thailand, it doesn't matter what your economic level is, everybody that I run into understands the QR code is the way to pay. Right? Most people don't carry cash anymore. And it doesn't matter what economic life cycle you're in. It doesn't matter at all, actually. And I've actually seen people begging, not that I'm proud of this, with a QR code. So it means that, I'm not kidding, it means they have a bank account somewhere.
No, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But my point is that if you're then assetizing, which I think is the word that you use, everything, at some point people are going to have to understand that everything has value. And I think this is the point you're trying to make. And maybe it took a roundabout way to get there. But that you don't have to then teach people that this is the way it's going to work. That's just the way it's going to work. And either you understand
it's going to come to you,
or you're not part of it at all, and then you don't exist.
Yeah, and it's going to come to you in the same way that our children learned about money when they were trading basketball cards in maybe a slightly older generation, Pokemon cards today, right? And one of the things that I feel is problematic right now in the digital world, which is where all of our attention is mostly, I mean, we're doing, is that we can't trade our digital attention and our time and our assets because they're not ours. So I can't trade my Fortnite skins.
No,
right?
but you should be able to.
But you should be able to, right?
Yeah,
but imagine if we could, how many of those children playing Fortnite would actually learn about money and have a degree of financial literacy?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like having your own lemonade stand outside your house because you see people passing by and it's the summertime and they're thirsty. Right. Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you've paid attention to this, but not too long ago, I think it was maybe a month or so ago, for Counter-Strike skins, basically Valve sort of literally devalued their ecosystem because they didn't think it benefited their own revenue stream versus the economy of the users. And it went from a $6 billion market and at one point dropped to close to 1.5 or 1.8 billion and wiped out close to $4 billion of value for gamers who were up in arms and literally sort of, picket fencing and saying, what the hell is going on? Right. But it just shows what happens when you don't have property rights. And in similar things like in society, a country that has property rights has a good GDP, has a good economy, and the ones that don't have a huge discount attached to it. Take the extreme, North Korea versus America as an extreme example.
No, it's a great example.
You have your answer.
Yeah, it's a great example. Okay.
If the CS skin is built on blockchain, they could have captured the secondary sales and captured royalties on top of that. Yeah,
that's right. They could tax it. And not only could they tax it, there are also the second and third order effects that happens when you are participating in a network. And that's why the parallel of open source and the composability, which is what blockchain does, but with a value construct, is so powerful. Because now I can basically capture second and third order effects in the value of the network through ownership of the network. So think about Ethereum. All of the people that are building on top of Ethereum, right? Whether it's DeFi or blockchain gaming or whatever, the fact that I own Ethereum tokens means that I broadly benefit from all of these network effects that are building on top of it, as opposed to just one product or one service, right? And that's actually what happens with open source as well. If I'm a contributor, I benefit from the next level contributions that happen. But with open source, I need to have some knowledge of code. I need to know how to do stuff. So only a small universe can benefit. But with owning a token in a network, everyone can benefit. Like we can all be stakeholders. I don't have to be a coder to be able to benefit in the participation of a network, which is much more broad and much more accessible. And if open source can be as big as it is right now and change the world, then from our vantage point, tokenizing essentially these networks is far more accessible and far easier to do. And frankly, I think is a much fairer and better gateway to a digital future.
And if what you're suggesting is true, it also means that it's massively undervalued. I would think, right, because not as many people are involved in it as should be, so not as many people have ownership of the tokens or of the networks as you suggest, yeah? Is that fair?
And going back to your first original question, you said, where are we in the cycle compared to the internet? I would say we're around 2002, slightly post.com bubble bust.
Okay, yeah, but again, we could spend hours talking about the Gartner hype cycle as well, and just because it's something that people know about, right? So where are we? Are we down here at the trough of disillusionment, or are we a little bit higher? Are we going up a little bit on this graph? Because again, I was there when the .com bubbled. You remember when they called Amazon.bomb, right?
Yes.
But they did. They did, and now it's one of the biggest, wealthiest, and most powerful companies in the world. Guys, I want to do this. I want to stop because the conversation has been really good, and I've taken up like 45 or 50 minutes of your time. But not because there's not more to talk about. Because I think we've covered some really, really great ground, and I want to leave all the parties still good. I just want to thank both of you guys for doing this, yeah? I really appreciate your time. So Waitze, Kenneth, Shek, you guys were both awesome, and hopefully you'll come back and have more conversations, and hopefully you enjoyed this as much as we did.
Thank you so much for having us.
A lot. Thank you so much.